What's the matter with you, Oseki-san? You look strange. Don't you feel good? Are you mocking me? I am serious, sir. We are so proud of you. You are famous. I never imagined what a great officer you are. I am ashamed for having been impolite to you in the past. What are you talking about, Oseki-san? I am the same Tamechi, the perennial drunkard, who often failed to settle accounts with you. I'll bet I still owe you some money. Oh, Tamechi-san, now you are mocking me. Any outstanding bills for you or your men are now written off. I proclaim a moratorium on Shigure, and tonight your party is on the house. I laughed and said, Now I know there is something wrong with you. You still do not understand. I know of the many destroyers that have been lost in battle. But your Shigure has survived its ordeals without losing a single one of our boys in all of its dazzling exploits. In catering to the Navy for 50 years, I have not accommodated so great an officer as you since the days of Admiral Heihachiro Togo, when he triumphed at Tsushima Strait in 1905. I see now, Oseki-san, that you have been reading the newspapers. Do not believe half of what you read. If Shigure pulled through her missions, it is because her officers and men worked hard and were lucky. Or perhaps because you prayed hard for our return so that you could collect our outstanding accounts. With this we both laughed, but she emphatically repeated that this party would not cost Shigure's men a penny. As she ushered me into the banquet hall, she whispered, Every geisha in Sasebo volunteered to entertain at this party, without fee. They say they would not serve those characters of Mayoko and Haguro for any price. Needless to say, that night's party was a most successful and happy one. The following day I arranged for all Shigure crewmen to have 10 days of home leave on a rotation basis. It was a great joy to see the first contingent of about 80 men leave Sasebo the following morning. But my happy days were numbered. On November 25th, a staff officer at the naval station showed me the latest action reports. There was a depressing account of one of the most disgraceful destroyer defeats in the history of Japan's navy. I read it over and over again. 5 destroyers led by Captain Kyoto Kagawa had left Rabaul on the 24th at 15:30 on a second transport mission to Buka. The first had been carried out by cruiser Yubari and my destroyer Shigure. We had met no enemy opposition. Kagawa, who was not a specialist and had no night battle experience, seems nevertheless to have made a correct appraisal of the danger. He divided his 5 ships into 2 groups, his own Onami and Makinami as the scout fighting ships and the 3 others as purely transport vessels. No opposition was encountered on the way in, and the 3 transport destroyers, Amagiri, Yugiri, Uzuki, landed their 920 troops and 35 tons of supplies on Buka Island shortly before midnight, without incident. These 3 destroyers took on board some 700 sick and ailing troops for return to Rabaul. Kagawa, with Onami and Makinami, some 8 miles ahead of the 3 transport destroyers, was taken by surprise with a torpedo attack from 5 destroyers under Captain Ali A. Burke. Onami sank before she could even return fire, and Makinami broke in 2 under enemy shell fire and sank shortly afterward. The Americans then observed and pursued the other 3. Yugiri, at the tail of the column, turned to engage the pursuers, but came under deadly U.S. destroyer gunfire, which sank her. Amagiri and Uzuki managed to escape. The results of this action were especially saddening for me, because Onami's skipper was my old friend, Commander Kiyoshi Kikawa, who, along with Kagawa, went down with his ship. He was neither stupid nor timid. His performance as skipper of destroyer Udachi off Guadalcanal had won him a deservedly high reputation. But even a man of his prowess and bravery was helpless before an enemy whose technical superiority provided accurate vision and aim in the dark of night. What would be the enemy's capability compared with my own when I returned to battle? The thought disturbed me greatly. I went back to the dockyard and pleaded for Shigure's swift repair. The repair chiefs replied that they would do all they could, but at best it would be a month before my ship was fit for combat. On November 26th, I was pleasantly surprised by a phone call from Vice Admiral Chuichi Nagumo, who invited me to dinner. I was delighted to accept. As Commander-in-Chief 1st Air Fleet, Nagumo had commanded the Pearl Harbor Striking Force and subsequent carrier operations through the Battle of Midway until July 1942, when he took command of the 3rd Fleet. In November 1942, he was appointed Commander-in-Chief Sasebo Naval District, and in June 1943 he was moved to the Kure Naval District. Now I had just learned of his reassignment as Commander-in-Chief 1st Fleet, a homeland training organisation, and was as flattered by his invitation as I was eager to learn his views and plans. His health was restored. He looked much better than the sorry man I had last seen at Truk a year earlier. But his conversation lacked spirit. In fact, all through our long dinner he urged me to speak of my experiences. He listened intently, complimented my work, and finally said, "But the heyday of our destroyers ended with the Battle of Cape St. George. Things might have been different there and after if we could have had a dozen destroyer skippers of your caliber." I did not know it at the time, but, despite his return to health, this wrinkled old officer was forlorn. In times since, I have realized that he must have then foreseen his own destruction, and that of the Imperial Japanese Navy as well. That was the last time I saw him. In March 1944, he was transferred to Saipan as Commander-in-Chief Central Pacific Area and 14th Air Fleet, and there he fought until his death the following July. On the next day, I joined the second group of 80 officers and men from Shigure in taking a 10-day home leave, and such a home leave never was before. By ones, twos, threes and fours, my men and officers came morning, afternoon and evening, always with large bottles of sake, to do me honour in my home. Some rode several hours by train to reach Kamakura in order to make the gesture. Accordingly, I sat and drank with them day and night. They always apologized to my wife for intruding and begged forgiveness for their seeming rudeness. But, they explained, "We have gone through the bloodiest of battles and emerged unscathed. It was miraculous, and possible only because of your husband. He is the greatest officer in the Imperial Navy. We gladly give up part of our time with our families to honour our esteemed captain in his home. Do not be harsh with us." They did all kinds of work around the house, running errands and playing with the children. For me, the steady bout of drinking made it the wettest few days of my life. It is a wonder I did not drown in sake. Secretly, my wife, and especially my 2 daughters, pronounced it a terrible home leave, but they put up with it. My son loved the robust guests. On December 6th, I returned to Sasebo, accompanied by a record-breaking hangover, which took a week to wear off. Shigure's overhaul and repair were completed on the 20th. Our 2-day shakedown cruise proved her fit for combat, and I reported to the High Command that she was ready to return to the South Pacific. I was ordered to stand by. After sweating it out for 3 days, in which every minute dragged like a week, I was summoned to Sasebo Naval Headquarters. The Deputy Commandant personally delivered orders which assigned me as an instructor to the torpedo school. I was infuriated and let it be known. "Shore duty for me? What's going on? Admiral Samejima himself told me that he needed me and was awaiting my return. I want to get back. I insist on it." "All right, Hara, now calm down. Before you lose your temper, there is something else you should know. Your assignment to the school as an instructor is no reflection on your service record, as is sometimes the case. This matter is still highly classified, but I can say that you will be in charge of a new school for training torpedo boatmen. Headquarters has decided that only you can fulfill a vital Navy need by training men to be torpedo experts. Don't scowl. You will be shouldering one of the most important tasks in the Navy." I did realize what the Rear Admiral was driving at, and was in agreement with the need for trained torpedo boatmen. This need was one that the Navy had been slow in accepting. "Hara," he continued, "you once revolutionized the torpedo doctrine of the Imperial Navy. You are now expected to revolutionize a phase of surface doctrine and tactics. You know better than anyone else that destroyers have had their day. You were chosen for this highly classified assignment upon very strong recommendations from Admiral Ijuin in Tokyo, Admiral Nagamo of the First Fleet, and Admiral Omori of the Torpedo School. Congratulations. Let me wish you every success. On returning to Shigure, I called the crew to assemble at the forecastle and spoke to them. Shipmates, I have been relieved as Commander Destroyer Squadron 27 and must leave immediately for Yokosuka and my new assignment. The past 10 months, in which we have lived and fought together, have been the happiest and most satisfying time of my career. I have been proud of you, and can now say that I have never commanded such a fine crew. Keep up your spirit and your skill, and I know you will continue to win with your new commander. Good luck. I shall miss all of you, but will always be wishing you well. Goodbye. I walked around to shake hands with everyone. Some mumbled farewells, some were silent, but very few cheeks or eyes were dry. Several men dashed off after shaking hands to relieve comrades who were standing watch. The duty men thus came in for their turn. I had my bags packed in half an hour and went over Shigure's side for the last time. I stood up in the boat for a farewell look as we pulled away from my proud ship. The scene was one I had never heard of in the cold, harsh, disciplined Imperial Navy. The crew lined the railings and clung to every vantage point of the superstructure and riggings, waving and shouting their farewell. I started to wave, but my heart was so full I had to sit down and weep. This was PT-109, Lieutenant John F. Kennedy USNR, which was sliced in two by Amagiri in the early hours of August 2, 1943, and sank in position 08°03S, 156°8E. 2 of 13 crew members were lost, and the survivors were finally rescued on the 7th, thanks to the valiant efforts of her skipper, who later became President of the United States. The U.S. naval force operating near Bougainville that night was Task Group 31.2, Commander Frederick Moosbrugger, consisting of Destroyer Division 12, destroyers Dunlap, Craven and Maury, and Destroyer Division 15, comprised of destroyers Lang, Sterrett and Stack. No Japanese torpedoes scored hits, though some were evaded only by skillful manoeuvring. Hara means one Navy transport, 5,879-ton Kishomaru, but also sunk by this raid were Army transports Tsukinada Maru, 526 tons, Kamoi Maru, 548 tons, Fuku Maru, 132 tons, and Navy patrol boat Mishima Muru. 3 destroyers, 3 submarines, an oiler, and a survey ship all received minor damage. These were paratroopers from the 2nd Paratroop Battalion, 1st Marine Amphibious Corps, but they came in by boat. These were 2 radar snoopers, SB-24, of Commersol's 5th Bombardment Group, which kept Admirals Halsey and Merrill well informed of the movement of these Japanese ships toward Empress Augusta Bay. The SB-24s located and first reported these ships about 15 miles east of Cape St. George. Captain Hara is quite right about the effectiveness of his destroyer's AA fire this day. It is noted in the official history of the Army Air Force as follows. 2 destroyers off the mouth of the Warangoi River, directly in the path of the approaching planes, caused some confusion as their fire, together with that of intercepting fighters, forced the B-25s to break formation and attack in 2-plane or individual bombing and strafing runs. The Army Air Forces in World War II, the Pacific, Guadalcanal to Saipan, Volenda 4, 326. It was USS Scamp, Lieutenant Dr. Walter G. Ebert, and she fired 7 torpedoes, claiming 1 hit and the sinking of a 7,000-ton freighter. Now retired, R. ADM Ebert lives in Muncie, Indiana. I reported to the Yokosuka Naval Station Personnel Office on December 27, 1943, and was brusquely told that my formal appointment was not yet ready and that I should come back after the New Year holidays. The only semblance of work in progress was people clearing off desks, apparently in preparation for their holiday. How could they be so concerned with holidays at this critical period of the war? You just go on home and take it easy, the officer continued in a cajoling voice. It's wonderful that you can be home on New Year's Day, isn't it? I guess it's a gesture on the part of the High Command in recognition of your exploits. To me, this attitude was shocking and disgusting. I glared my displeasure and almost roared in anger to remind these people of our serious setbacks in the Solomons. Instead, I turned and strode from the room. The Naval Torpedo School was located at Opama, just north of Yokosuka. There I stormed into the commandant's office and unleashed my pent-up anger to Vice Admiral Sentaro Omori. He was embarrassed, but after listening patiently to my outburst, he said, "I know what you mean, Hara, but these people at home can never know the vital urgency of war as do we who have been in battle. You must learn, as I have, that we cannot change the world, but must be patient and do what we can when we can." I returned to Kamakura, just 20 minutes by train from Opama, with a bad taste in my mouth. I looked at the streets for the first time in many months and was shocked. Kamakura, one of the beauty spots of Japan, was a ghost town. No bombs had fallen, but the stores were empty. People on the streets appeared depressed and hungry. Our enormous shipping losses in the Solomons were beginning to tell in the homeland, dependent as it was on imports. My anger abated then, giving way to depression, and I arrived home with mixed feelings. When my wife and children rushed out to greet me joyously, I shook off all unpleasant thoughts, thankful for the chance to be home. On January 10, 1944, the same date Admiral Koga decided to move his combined fleet headquarters from Truk to Palau, I formally became senior instructor of the Naval Torpedo School. It is strange that Japan had not used torpedo boats earlier in the war. In its preoccupation with big ships, the Navy High Command had not developed torpedo boats and their tactics. Japanese naval officers were appalled at the brisk activity of American torpedo boats in the Solomons and at the rapid attrition of Japanese destroyers. To this situation, the natural reaction was to build torpedo boats and train crews for them, but Japan's decision was too late. Such miscalculations on the part of the Japanese Navy were by no means restricted to torpedo boats. The problems of aviator training and radar development were also neglected too long. By late 1943, Japanese electronic factories were working day and night to build radar sets, but by then too many Japanese warships had been sunk in the Solomons. In pre-war days, Japan trained very few flyers out of thousands of applicants. The Navy did not change this policy until late in 1943, when most of its crack pilots, who should have been teaching, had already been killed in action. When the Navy belatedly started to train aviators on a mass production basis, it discovered that the aircraft factories were unable to keep pace with the demand for planes. All 100 of my students at the torpedo school were college and university graduates who had originally volunteered for flight training and duty. After 3 months of preliminary air training, these men were all switched to surface assignments and thus to my torpedo boat class, simply because of lagging airplane production. My students were all in their early 20s. They were serious and enthusiastic, but being reservists, complete amateurs, and totally unlike the academy men to whom I had taught my destroyer torpedo formula in this same school some years before. I quickly discovered a great need for patience. In teaching professionals, I was very stern and never hesitated to criticize ineptness. The professionals all had years of training and experience, and thus expected strict discipline. But my present group of reservists were like caricatures of students. I found it of no use to scold, no matter how clumsy and stupid they were. How could such amateurs be made into efficient torpedo boat men in the prescribed 3 months of training? Many times I thought of resigning out of sheer desperation. Our equipment was deplorable. We had only 10 small, dilapidated torpedo boats, barely capable of making 18 knots. Almost every day I prodded Admiral Omori for better ones, but they were slow in arriving. Because of the Navy's tardy interest in torpedo boats, the arsenals were slow in producing the small but powerful engine they required. The first new boat arrived at the school in February, and I was totally disgusted with its performance. After a test run of the 20-ton craft, I returned it to the pier and ranted, "This is no torpedo boat. It is nothing but a barge. This scow would be of no value in a real fight." Omori and my instructors were glumly silent. The designer, visibly pale, stepped forward and explained apologetically that this boat was equipped with an old airplane engine. "We simply cannot produce the new engine needed for this type of boat. There are too many bottlenecks, including a critical shortage of materials." Too angry and discouraged to speak, I stalked away. The next few torpedo boats to be delivered were no better. Insofar as I know, only 200 or so boats, ranging from 15 to 30 tons, were produced under the Emergency Wartime Programme beginning in 1943. All were equipped with old aircraft engines, and none could make better than 25 knots. Their V-shaped hulls of steel or wood were 45 to 55 feet overall. Manned by a crew of 7, these boats were armed with 2 small torpedoes and one 13mm machine gun. But none ever came up to the standards I would have desired. It was painful to consider that the nation which could produce the world's greatest battleships was unable under pressure to produce a single satisfactory torpedo boat. The training program for my first class of 100 students was extended for a few weeks, and they were graduated at the end of April 1944. My remarks to them on that occasion made Admiral Omori and my teaching colleagues quite unhappy. "Your boats are unfortunately inferior to any fighting craft of the enemy. As I have tried to drum into you every day, you will have to rely on stealth. You will not be able to outfight the enemy. You will have to take advantage of every use of camouflage or ruse to be successful. Otherwise, you will be nothing but practice targets for the enemy guns." Teaching was a wearying job. The classroom windows overlooked the calm port of Yokosuka, and the view made me long for life at sea. Hard and harsh as destroyer life had been in the Solomons, I looked back on it as a time of happiness, with its thrills and exultations, all of which were completely lacking in the school. News from the war front was frequently long delayed and usually incomplete, but I went to Yokosuka headquarters for occasional information about my former ships. A Matsukaze served as escort to transports plying between the homeland and the Southwest Pacific without incident during 1943. But shortly after the start of my school, I was shocked by news that she had been torpedoed 250 miles north of Spratly Island in January 1944, and that 80 members of her crew had been killed. Although badly damaged, the destroyer was able to reach Saigon. Emergency repairs there enabled her to be moved to Singapore for further work, which was not completed until March 1945, when she was again seaworthy. Shigure was also used on escort duty after leaving Sasebo with her new squadron commander on board. I was saddened to learn that she was hit on February 17, 1944, by an aerial bomb which did only minor damage to the ship, but killed 21 of her crew. The most shocking part of this news was that she had been hit at Truk, which I knew as a calm haven, immune from air attack. There must have been a shocking laxity at Truk if Shigure, which had survived so many attacks in the Solomons and at Rabaul, could fall victim to air attack there. Further horrifying news followed shortly. On March 30th, an American task force under Admiral Raymond A. Spruance struck the Caroline Islands, shredding the defences at Palau. Admiral Koga took off that evening from Babaltwap to transfer his fleet headquarters to Davao in the Philippines, and was never heard from again. Meanwhile, I was ordered to Kawatana, near Sasebo, immediately after the graduation of my first class. My assignment was to set up a new torpedo boat school there, because Opama could not accommodate the increasing number of students assigned. I was probably chosen for the transfer because of my continual griping about conditions and equipment at Opama, which tended to spread discontent. Whatever the reason, I welcomed the change. I was tired of griping, and the prospect of being commandant of an independent school was pleasant. Kawatana is a small fishing village on the shore of Omura Bay. The Navy had maintained a small torpedo testing range there for many years, but it had not been used recently. I arrived on May 3rd to find the most decrepit barracks of my experience. I was met by a dozen maintenance men who must have wondered what made me chuckle as I inspected the ruins which were to serve as billet and school for the revolutionizing of the Navy's surface tactics. It struck me as being very funny. A petty officer in charge of the maintenance crew told me that Admiral Koga had been given up as lost, and that Admiral Soemu Toyoda had been named his successor as Commander-in-Chief Combined Fleet. This surprised me even more than my school's miserable facilities, but I could see nothing funny in it. I felt strongly that Admiral Toyoda was not the man for this job. He had been commandant of the Yokosuka Naval Station when I left Opama. Prior to that, he was a member of the Supreme War Council, and still earlier, at the start of the war, commandant of the Kure Naval District. He had never seen action in this war. Just as Koga had been plucked from quiet China waters to succeed Yamamoto, his successor was also a man without battle experience. Why at this time did the High Command pick as Commander-in-Chief a man totally unknown to most of the sailors at the fighting front? I wondered often about this while organizing my new school. A week later, 200 students arrived for torpedo boat training. Like my class at Opama, they had all been transferred from aviation schools. With 6 assistants, 3 of them picked from the Opama graduating class, I resumed the frustrating profession of a teacher. My premonition about Toyoda soon proved sadly true. He was not the man for the job. On June 1920, Vice Admiral Jisaburo Ozawa's carrier task force suffered a disastrous defeat at the hands of the Americans in the so-called Marianas Turkey Shoot. Ozawa tried to engage the enemy by making use of his longer-range Japanese combat planes. But Admirals Toyoda, Ozawa, and Kurita, who mapped out the strategy of this operation, did not reckon sufficiently with the effectiveness of enemy radar and the enemy's increased pilot skill and plane capability, nor with the correlative decrease in the skill of Japanese pilots. The result was that Ozawa lost 3 carriers and 500 planes, and the Navy lost its last real task force. 4 months later, Ozawa took 3 empty carriers on a decoy mission to the Philippines, and lost them all without achieving anything. Almost every day brought shocking news, and all too often it touched me closely. A radio newscast in the evening of July 10th reported that Saipan had fallen to the enemy the previous day, and that Vice Admiral Chuichi Nagumo had died there. I was standing in my room, stunned at this news, when a wire message from Yokosuka was delivered. It was a directive for me to train students henceforth for the main purpose of fighting the enemy on the coasts of Japan. My reaction to this order was something I will never understand, but it affected me most strangely. My hands trembled and my face turned scarlet in anger. I tore the message into bits, threw it into the wastebasket, and sat down at my desk to write a petition to Emperor Hirohito. It was a preposterous thing to do, but I simply could not control myself. I wrote that Japan had already lost the war, and I appealed to the Emperor to see the situation realistically. I pointed out that the ranking positions in the Army and Navy were held by superannuated officers unfamiliar with modern warfare, and that continual bickering between the Army and Navy leaders blocked efficiency of operation both in the military and in industry, as exemplified by our lagging production in planes and torpedo boats. I urged the Emperor to consider a termination of the war and, as a first step, to dismiss all incompetent admirals and generals. I had become a hot-headed revolutionary. Perhaps it was the long-continued frustrations of my teaching job which caused me to suddenly write this petition. My act was not only insubordination, but treason as well, according to naval regulations, and I could be court-martialed for it. But I did not think of such a possibility. I forgot everything except that the nation was tottering to a catastrophic fall. When my petition was completed, I boarded the first train for Tokyo. On the 12th of July, I stomped into the Navy Ministry where the first person I saw was Rear Admiral Prince Takamatsu, the second brother of Emperor Hirohito. I dashed up to him. "Prince Takamatsu," May I have a man-to-man talk with you? The prince looked at me and probably thought me a little daft, but he nodded and I followed him to his office. There I offered the petition, requesting that he present it to the emperor. May I read it before doing so? He asked. Certainly, Your Highness. He slowly unfolded the paper and manned its contents. His brow wrinkled and he appeared disturbed by what he read. He looked at me again, probably wondering just how insane I really was, and put the petition in his pocket. All right, Hara, he said as he stood up. Take good care of yourself. I never found out what Prince Takamatsu did with my petition, but he must have been discreet about mentioning it in Navy circles. Had word of my writing ever reached the Navy Minister or the High Command, I would have been dealt with in summary fashion. Immediately after delivering the petition to the Prince, I took the next train back to Kawatana to await the Emperor's reaction. When nothing happened, I came to my senses gradually and realized how outrageous my action had been. Neither the Emperor nor any other member of the royal family could take action on my petition. He was, after all, a constitutional monarch, and under the Constitution could not initiate any action. This rule was broken a little, more than a year later, however, when he personally decided in favor of the surrender of Japan. With grim resignation, I attended the graduation of my 200 students at the end of July. On August 1st, the barracks were jammed to overflowing by 400 new students, like the others, transferred from aviation schools. When I saw them, some without blankets, sleeping on the floor, packed like canned sardines, I decided to quit my griping and be a devoted teacher. These youngsters were serious-minded patriots, and they deserved my best efforts regardless of their professional limitations. The training period for these 400 students was drawing to a close when action erupted in the Philippines. American landings at Leyte on October 20th led to a series of naval engagements which decimated what remained of the Imperial Navy. On the 27th, an unprecedented communiqué announced the formation of the Kamikaze Corps, a volunteer suicide aerial attack unit. This stunning news horrified the Kawatana school. It was also a blow to me, since I had always preached that men's lives should be spared. Since I drilled into my students the idea of attack and return, these new tactics were to me inhuman and intolerable. My ideas of revolt subsided, however, when I read the detailed reports of how the pilots had actually volunteered for these sure-hit but sure-death attacks. In the solitude of my room, I wept aloud. My 400 students were graduated at the end of October in a ceremony which greeted the arrival of another 400 new students. In the same week, our school had an unexpected visitor in the person of my old friend from Rabaul, Captain Toshio Miyazaki. This former commander of Destroyer Division 17 was now senior instructor in the torpedo school at Opama. Announcing his arrival in person, Miyazaki confided that he had come by special train, carrying a surprise cargo, and he asked me to accompany him to see it. In the railroad yard, he led me to a freight car guarded by an armed detail which had accompanied it from Yokosuka. The cargo was transferred to the old torpedoing range, where it was opened to reveal 3 small torpedo boats and a dozen sets of lightweight diving gear. The boats, made of plywood and powered by an automobile engine, looked like ordinary motorboats. Their novelty lay in their warhead bows filled with high explosives. When Miyazaki whispered, "This craft is a surface kamikaze," I could only groan in anguish. To break the awkward silence, I asked about the diving gear. "That," explained my friend, "is for frogmen who will walk the bottom of the sea with their own supply of oxygen, carrying a compact explosive charge to be attached to the screw or rudder of an enemy ship." He walked silently back to my quarters, where Miyazaki went into more detail. The tiny 1- or 2-man torpedo boats and the frogman ideas had been approved by the High Command about the time I was sent to Kawatana. The suicide tactics were the subject of long and heated debate until the initiation of the kamikaze units in the Philippines, and then there was a sudden decision in favor of their adoption. "Knowing you as he does," Miyazaki continued, Admiral Omori detailed me especially to come here and present this explanation. Knowing you as I do, I realize how awkward this mission is. I will listen to anything you wish to say, but I must advise you again that this tactical formula has already been adopted. I considered his remark and thoughtfully replied, I know how you feel, Miyazaki, and am in no mood to argue with you. But you know as well as I do that the hurriedly trained graduates of this school will be little more than cannon fodder when they go into action in these slow barges called torpedo boats. I have known all along that they have little chance of survival. Yet, even against their overwhelming odds, that is different from asking boys to commit suicide. How can we ask them to kill themselves? Miyazaki was solemn. Hara, during the past 50 hours on my sleepless ride here from Yokosuka in those freight cars, I have been thinking long and hard about this. The only thing for us to do is to honestly explain the harsh realities of the situation. I plan to tell your students how the men in my destroyer division were killed, despite their skill and long years of experience. Now we are dying in the Philippines. All servicemen must face death. I hear that the kamikaze pilots volunteered unanimously for their unconventional sorties after hearing how 500 comrades with hundreds of hours of flying experience were killed like flies in the Marianas. These are rationalizations, to be sure, and I know what your feelings are. It is because of your acknowledged genius in bringing men back alive, even from the savage Solomon's battles, that Omori sent me to you on this unenviable mission. And it is because I know and understand you that I was willing to come. Miyazaki, usually a swashbuckling, devil-may-care sort, looked beaten and miserable. I thought over the many things that occurred to me and finally said, I thank you, Miyazaki, for your trouble in coming here. I know that neither the circumstances nor the conditions were pleasant for you, and I appreciate your kindness. In thinking of the things you have just said, I recall my combat-seasoned destroyer Samidare. I have just learned that despite all her great exploits, she was torpedoed and sunk near Palau with the loss of half her crew. A destroyer bagged by a submarine. That's a cat eaten by a mouse. What irony. Shiratsuyu fared even worse. This ship of gallant early actions turned sour after sideswiping Samidar at Empress Augusta Bay. I hear that she collided with a tanker off Mindanso last June and sank with a loss of 224 men. My old flagship Shigure, the Miracle Destroyer, barely survived the Leyte Gulf battles, as the sole survivor of the Nishimura force. But I have the firm feeling that her time will come soon. That fine ship with all my old shipmates. What a war this is. With that, Miyazaki and I had nothing more to say to each other. We shook hands and parted for the night. Next morning I summoned a full assembly of the school. Miyazaki spoke first to explain the new weapons and their use. The atmosphere in the dilapidated barracks hall was tense, and the audience sat incredulously silent. When Miyazaki finished, I trudged to the podium and said, I have no orders for you. You came here to prepare yourselves for conventional torpedo boats. You have just learned of 2 other weapons that have been authorized for study in this school. Starting tomorrow, either of the 3 courses of study will be open to you. You have a free choice of which class you wish to attend, according to your own aptitude and inclination. I want your choice to be made without compulsion or influence from anyone, according to the dictates of your own conscience. This is my ruling. I will be in my office this afternoon and evening as long as is necessary. Each of you will report to me personally on your choice. There will be no questions asked or explanations required as to why you make the choice you do. That is all. One by one, the 400 students came to my office. The last one did not leave until 0400 the next morning. When they had all reported, I called Miyazaki and we sorted out the papers containing each name with the student's course preference. Our tabulation showed that 200 had chosen the conventional torpedo boat course, 150 elected for duty in the suicide boats, and the other 50 as frogmen. Miyazaki, exhausted after long sleepless hours, heaved a deep sigh. So did I. The suicide boats were given the poetic name Shinyo, which means literally ocean shaker. The frogmen were called Fukuryu, which has the literal meaning of crawling dragon. Considering their aggressive purpose, the ocean shakers were not an effective craft. Shortly after the 3 boats arrived at Kawatana, I asked the nearby naval air station at Omura to send a fighter plane over for a practice encounter. An instructor manned the boat into open water, but he jumped overboard when the plane swooped low directly over the craft. On the next pass, the fighter sprayed machine gun bullets into the flimsy shell, smashing it to bits. The crawling dragon equipment was even more useless. The 50 men, all expert swimmers, had trouble with it throughout the course. Even the tanked oxygen supplied to the school was no good. Several student divers fell sick from it on the very first day. What could these crude efforts do against a powerful enemy supplied with the finest of modern scientific equipment? Bitter pessimism shriveled my heart. Each day of the school was more depressing for me, and I took to drinking heavily again. About 100 graduates of the conventional torpedo boat school were sent to the Philippines and Okinawa, many to die without any significant achievements. All of the other graduates were held in preparation for opposing the anticipated invasion of the homeland. It has been some consolation to know that most of my fine students were not sacrificed in suicide missions. On December 20th, 1944, Miyazaki relieved me as commandant of the depressing school at Kawatana, and my new orders were for sea duty as commanding officer of light cruiser Yahagi. That was my happiest day of a very unhappy year. It was a joyous commanding officer who climbed the ramp of light cruiser Yahagi at Sasebo on December 22nd, 1944. I was back where I belonged, with a chance to fight again, freed of the frustrations at Kawatana. My appointment to this command was a great honor. The ship's senior officers turned out to welcome me. Commander Shinichi Uchino, the executive officer, announced excitedly, "Yahagi's crew is overjoyed at having you as our new skipper. The youngest recruits are already speaking proudly of our miracle captain." I expressed pleasure at my good fortune in being given command of Yahagi and said, "Never having commanded such a big ship, I will have plenty to learn from each of you." My remarks were received appreciatively, and everyone appeared elated with my arrival. If it was a morale booster for the ship, it was needed. Just returned from the disastrous Leyte Gulf battle, Yahagi had been flagship of a support group in Vice Admiral Takeo Kurita's Second Fleet. Details of that battle were still unknown, even to the Japanese who had taken part in it. But many knew that the Japanese Navy had taken a beating and that the United States was winning back the Philippine Islands. When Admiral Kurita made his celebrated retirement on October 25th, after inflicting heavy damage on an escort carrier force, though he failed to disrupt the landing operations at Leyte Gulf, Yahagi and 3 accompanying destroyers were still some 10 miles away. From that extreme distance, Yahagi and her companions released torpedoes, all of them wasted. The sluggish performance of these ships was a disappointment to all who were aware of it. Rear Admiral Susumu Kimura, commander of Destroyer Squadron 10, which included Yahagi and 6 destroyers, was relieved of his post after the battle. He was an expert navigator, but not a fighter. Kimura's disinclination to battle had been clearly illustrated as early as November 1942, when his light cruiser Nagara failed to engage the enemy off Guadalcanal. Yet almost every other Japanese warship in this action fought at point-blank range. To use him thereafter in such an important battle as Leyte illustrates again, but does not explain, the mysterious mental processes of the Japanese High Command. An even more serious blunder was the retaining of Admirals Kurita and Ozawa in command positions. Both of them survived the war, and they are still alive. I do not like to criticize men of their integrity, but the retention of these 2 tired and aged admirals on active duty was a great factor in the disastrous defeat at Leyte. Kurita has told me, "I made that blunder of retiring out of sheer physical exhaustion." On the subject of Leyte, Ozawa has admitted to me, I am ashamed to have survived the battle. This greatest of all naval actions in history has been the subject of extensive writing. I disagree with many of the opinions expressed, but I agree wholeheartedly with C. Vann Woodward when he concludes in his The Battle for Leyte Gulf. What was needed on the flag bridge of Yamato on the morning of the 25th was not a hamlet but a hotspur, a Japanese Halsey, instead of a kurita. Kurita had shown frightful ineptness when he took his second fleet to Rabaul in November 1943, only to be shot up. But he, like Ozawa, was retained. As a consequence, the two of them were in command of the Japanese forces which took such a trouncing in the Marianas Battle of June 19, 1944. They were still retained after that debacle, for reasons I have never understood. Both men were tired from the beginning. Sending them to Leyte was bound to be disastrous, especially since neither of their fleets was provided with effective air cover. The greater responsibility, however, rests on Admiral Soemu Toyoda, Commander-in-Chief Combined Fleet. Arriving in Japan on October 18 from Formosa, he directed the battle first from Yokosuka and then moved 30 miles inland to Hiyoshi to carry on his duties. Thus, this unrealistic operation was planned and directed on land by an admiral who had never taken part in a naval action. The causes of Japan's defeat in the Battle of Leyte Gulf are numerous, but high on the list must be mentioned her deficiencies in airplanes, radar, and communications. The dying Japanese fleets fought well, considering that in addition to being without aerial defense or striking power, they were practically blind and deaf. Japan's war was lost with the fall of Saipan. Thereafter, her many battleships and heavy cruisers, long conserved, were merely thrown into the slaughter at Leyte. Kurita was replaced as commander of the Second Fleet by Vice Admiral Seiyehi Ito on the day I joined Yahagi. Like so many other high-level decisions of the time, this one too astounded me. Ito had been on the Naval General Staff since the start of the Pacific War. He had had no sea duty whatsoever, let alone any combat experience during the war. The personnel section of Naval Headquarters seemed to be unreasonable in most of the assignments of those days. Kurita, with all the blunders of his career, was made Commandant of the Naval Academy on his return from Leyte. Ozawa was promoted to become Commander-in-Chief Combined Fleet in May 1945. It is remarkable that most of the commanding officers who survived the Leyte battles were promoted. Meanwhile, Second Fleet remnants limped home by 2s and 3s. In mid-January, Yahagi joined Yamato and 5 destroyers at Hashirajima anchorage near Hiroshima. Remembering the sight of hundreds of warships filling this wide harbour just 4 years earlier, I was saddened to view these few leftovers that now comprised the scaled-down Second Fleet, a fleet that hardly deserved the name. While we drilled, I kept an eye out for either of my old ships which might arrive to join us. Shige had been a part of Nishimura's force when he led his 2 battleships, a cruiser, and 4 destroyers in a mysterious, uncoordinated approach to Leyte Gulf on October 25, 1944. Every ship of this force except Shigure was sunk. By surviving, she became the target of harsh criticism and evil rumour which I could not believe. I wanted to talk with her crew and learn the truth. Instead of the long-awaited reunion, however, word came that Shige had been torpedoed and sunk by an enemy submarine north of Singapore on January 24th. What a shame that such a fine ship should fall victim to a submarine. This word was followed shortly by news that a Matsukaze was staying in China waters and so would not be able to join the Second Fleet. But not all news was bad. New weapons and equipment for Yahagi arrived almost daily. There were proximity fuses, homing torpedoes, and, most important of all, efficient radar sets. Gun crews began to learn how to use radar-controlled gunfire. Many of these devices were still in the experimental stage, but their appearance was a sign that Japanese technology was moving forward. Too late to catch up with the enemy, to be sure, but it was a tremendous morale booster in those days of adversity. All training, however, was limited to the narrow inland sea. I asked why we did not go to the open sea to engage in some high-speed combat exercises, and was told that our limited fuel supplies would not permit it. I knew that fuel supplies were low, but was staggered to know that there was not even enough for essential basic training. After heavy preliminary bombardment, the Americans began the invasion of Iwo Jima on February 19, 1945. Not a single Japanese warship was sent to oppose this enemy landing, only 700 miles from the homeland. Meanwhile, the bombing of Japanese cities by B-29 superforts from Marianas bases continued with increasing intensity. The High Command returned to its old formula of conservation, this time of fighter planes. They were put under camouflage or hauled away into revetments safe from air attack, leaving the enemy unopposed in his bombing of the homeland. In Imperial headquarters, hot debate raged for many days on what should be done with the remnants of the combined fleet. Admiral Ito reported on March 1st that training exercises were completed and his force of 1 battleship, 1 cruiser, and 10 destroyers was ready for action. But the High Command was still undecided whether to use the impoverished Second Fleet for present attack or save it for homeland defense against invasion. While angry arguments continued in Tokyo headquarters, the Second Fleet entered Kure Harbour and took on its meagre allotment of fuel. The Navy argued for conservation of its dwindling strength. The Army pointed to Leyte Gulf as showing the folly of conserving ships until they merely fell prey to enemy air attack. On March 19th, the Army argument finally prevailed, for on that day an American task force closed the home shores and hurled hundreds of planes in an attack on shipping at Kure and Kobe. No ships were sunk in these assaults, but 17 warships were injured, including slight damage to 6 carriers and 3 battleships, among them Isa and Hyuga, which survived the action at Leyte Gulf, only to be hit while docked at Kure. The Army generals nodded derisively at these losses, which were increased when the carrier plane attacks continued on the 20th. The 5th Naval Air Fleet, newly organised in February 1945, fought back with hundreds of kamikaze planes. Its commanding officer, Vice Admiral Matome Ugaki, who had been Yamamoto's chief of staff, issued a report saying, "Our special attack planes accounted for 7 enemy carriers, 2 battleships, and 1 cruiser either sunk or badly damaged." This exaggerated report helped restore the Navy's falling stock in Tokyo headquarters, but it backfired. Top strategists naively believed the report and placidly concluded that after such a setback, the enemy task force would have to retire to Ulithi for repairs before it could strike again. 3 days later, on March 23rd, hundreds of American carrier planes began making daily strikes all over Okinawa. This assault was followed directly with bombardment of the island by American warships. Japanese staff officers were stunned, but took no action. Instead, they predicted wishfully that landing operations would not be carried out until much later. But the American task forces were not just visiting in Okinawan waters. They had come to stay. Imperial headquarters finally ordered all-out aerial opposition on March 26th. The American hordes walked ashore on April 1st, practically unopposed. Lieutenant General Mitsuru Ushijima, commanding the defending 32nd Army, had wisely learned that defence in depth was more effective than trying to annihilate the enemy at the water's edge. The Navy cried, "Why doesn't the Army put up a fight?" To which the Army retorted, "Why don't Navy ships sink the enemy task force?" This kind of haggling achieved nothing, but Admiral Toyoda, who had endured Army nagging for 5 months, finally gave in on April 5th and decided to use the Second Fleet, 4 full days after the enemy invasion had begun. That day is notable for 2 other events of consequence to Japan. Prime Minister, General, Kuniaki Koiso resigned and was replaced by retired Admiral Kantaro Suzuki, and the Soviet Union notified Japan that it would not extend their non-aggression pact. I knew nothing then of these behind-the-scenes moves. On that hazy morning, the Second Fleet was moored near Tokuyama in the Inland Sea. From light cruiser Yahagi's bridge, I was looking idly around at giant battleship Yamato and our 8 destroyers. 2 had been docked at Kure because of engine trouble, that swung at anchor. They were organized as follows: Battleship Yamato, Rear Admiral Kosaku Ariga. Destroyer Squadron 2, Rear Admiral Keizo Komura in Yahagi. Destroyer Division 17, Captain Kichi Shintani. Isokaze, Commander Saneo Maeda. Hamakaze, Commander Isami Mukoi. Yukikaze, Commander Masamichi Terauchi. Destroyer Division 21, Captain Hisao Kotaki. Asashimo, Commander Yoshiro Sugihara. Kasumi, Commander Hiru Yamana. Hatsushimo, Commander Masazo Sato. Destroyer Division 41, Captain Masayoshi Yoshida Fuyutsuki. Commander Hidechika Sakuma Suzutsuki. Commander Shigetaka Amano. Japan's great Second Fleet of the early part of the war was now reduced to these few ships. My musings on past glories and present weakness were interrupted by the approach of a seaplane from the southeast. It came in swiftly for a smooth landing and taxied to the side of Yamato. I watched several figures scramble up the accommodation ladder of the huge battleship. Even as I wondered who they were, Yamato's signal flags announced, "Operation Tengo now in force." Almost immediately there was bustling activity in every warship, for the Tengo operation meant that the Navy would make an all-out effort at Okinawa. Rear Admiral Keizo Komura, who had replaced Kimura in flagship Yahagi and had been sharing the bridge with me, was summoned to Yamato. He hurried into a waiting motorboat and was on his way. It was evident that the seaplane had brought high-ranking passengers with important information. I kept an anxious eye on the battleship, and after 2 hours with no sign, was getting impatient. At 11:30, Yamato signalled, "From Admiral Komura to all division commanders and ship captains. Meet Komura on board Yahagi for a noon conference." Komura returned to Yahagi promptly, visibly excited but volunteering nothing to me. In answer to my question about the excitement, he snapped, "Never mind, Hera, not now. Wait until they all arrive." This startled me because he was an easygoing man who seldom showed his feelings. I left him alone and watched the 8 boats from the destroyers as they approached Yahagi. The conference started promptly at noon, with Komura addressing the group. "Gentlemen, you have all seen the signal that Operation Tengo is now in force. Vice Admiral Ryunosuke Kusaka, the Combined Fleet Chief of Staff, has just come from Kanoya to confer with the flag-rank officers of our fleet." His audience of 4 captains and 8 commanders were deadly silent. After a short pause, Komura continued, "The operation formula proposed by Kusaka is an extraordinary one. The High Command wants the Second Fleet to sortie for Okinawa, without air cover, with fuel enough for only a one-way trip. In short, the High Command wants us to engage in a kamikaze mission. No, this is not even a kamikaze mission, for that implies the chance of chalking up a worthy target. I told Kusaka that our little fleet has no chance against the might of the enemy forces, and that such an operation would be a genuine suicide sortie. Aruga and Morishita agreed with me. Admiral Ito said nothing, so I do not know his opinion of the proposal. As you all know, I was Chief of Staff to Ozawa when he went on the decoy mission to the Philippines and lost 4 carriers. I have had to do with the killing of enough of our own men. I am not concerned with my death, but I do shrink from the wanton throwing of my own men into a suicidal sortie. Accordingly, I asked Ito and Kusaka for a recess in order to get your opinions." With these words, Komura clamped his jaw tightly and closed tear-filled eyes. There was a strained silence which I was about to break when Captain Eiichi Shintani, who a year before had relieved my friend Miyazaki as commander of Destroyer Division 17, spoke up. "Has Kusaka come to cram these orders down our throats?" Komura answered, "No one can tell another to kill himself. Kusaka has not mentioned orders. If he has them, he is not saying so. At this point we can only present to him our ideas and opinions." Shintani blushed a deep scarlet, took a deep breath and declared, "I sortied with Kurita for Leyte the day after the Americans landed. It looks like the High Command is pursuing that fatal formula again if they want us to thrust at the enemy's consolidated beachhead at Okinawa. The Kurita effort was more valid, however, because he at least had Ozawa as a decoy. Without a decoy, we have no chance. Ours would be a ridiculous operation. If we try such a thing, we will all perish, and then who will defend the homeland? I am opposed to it. I agree with Shintani, said Captain Hisao Kodaki, commander of Destroyer Division 21. The High Command has been blundering now for many months. Why must we, who have been through many battles, blindly follow a bunch of inept, inexperienced leaders? Why are we not called upon for a proposal based on our practical experience? There were instant sounds of approval from the skippers under Shintani and Kodaki. This was rapidly becoming the liveliest naval conference of my experience. But Kimura sat perfectly silent and motionless, his eyes still closed. I felt impelled to say, "The realistic thing for us to do is to attack the enemy's overextended lines of supply. I would like permission to go on a lone wolf mission. Yahagi now has radar and sonar equipment, and I think she could go out alone and account for at least half a dozen enemy ships before they could get us. That strikes me as a worthwhile mission. The proposed fleet mission to Okinawa would, in my estimation, be just like throwing an egg at a rock." Captain Masayoshi Yoshida of Destroyer Division 41 spoke up next. "Hara has expressed my opinion exactly. My destroyers Fuyutsuki and Suzutsuki are the very latest in anti-aircraft ships. These destroyers were built with blood, tears and taxes of our impoverished nation, and have yet to be given a worthy assignment. I am positive that they could serve best on an independent mission such as Hara has described." Commander Yoshiro Sugihara, skipper of Samidare when she sank in August, and now commanding a Sashimo, vehemently seconded Yoshida's remarks. "I am living on velvet," he said, "and am prepared to die at any moment, but not meaninglessly as this action requires. My Asashimo is 2,520 tons of fighting warship. I would like a full chance to make her an asset to the nation." The conference was interrupted when orderlies brought lunch, but the food was tasteless. During the meal, the destroyer skippers voiced their opinions in the general vein of what had already been said. At 1300, Kimura went back to Yamato. The rest of us waited grimly in Yahagi until he finally returned at 1600. His face was haggard when he entered the salon slowly and said in a tired, croaking voice, "I have accepted the orders, which went into effect at 1530. He seemed relieved to have gotten this off his chest. Then, looking around the room at each of us in turn, he gave a detailed account of the fateful meeting. "I spent a full hour in conveying your opinions and my concurrence in them. Kusaka and the others listened to me intently. When I finished, Kusaka explained that this sortie was a decoy mission. He emphasized that it was not his plan, but that it had been worked out during his visit at Kanoya. While enemy carriers are occupied in opposing our fleet, Kanoya, as the southernmost airfield on Kyushu, will fling hundreds of kamikaze planes at Okinawa. Kusaka assured me that this decoy sortie will not end in vain, as did my last one. Then he turned to Morishita and explained that the High Command, and especially the army members, had been dismayed by Yamato's break-off at Leyte. Kusaka said that he felt it was not Morishita's fault, for he had worked a wonder in dodging all torpedoes, while Musashi fell victim to them. Yet he said that Tokyo was displeased that Yamato had returned without firing her 18.1-inch guns at the enemy. Morishita took these remarks very hard. Kusaka said to Aruga that the whole nation would hate the Navy if the war should end with Yamato still intact. Through no fault of Aruga's, Yamato had been out of action for 3 years prior to Leyte, and was being spoken of as a floating hotel for idle, inept admirals. Ito broke his long silence at this point and said, "I think we are being given an appropriate chance to die. A samurai lives so that he is always prepared to die." That ended all argument. When Morishita and then Aruga finally gave in, I did too. Kimura bent his head low at these last words, as if apologizing. We sat in stunned silence. As the hour-like moments passed, I decided to face the reality of this most unreal situation. "We appreciate your stand on our behalf, Admiral Kimura," I said. "But orders are orders. We must now make the best of the situation." Admiral Kimura looked at me gratefully and said, "Thank you, Hara." The 3 division commanders, Kodaki, Shintani, Yoshida, accepted the orders, subject to the approval of their skippers. The 8 commanders chorused their unanimous acceptance. This abrupt change of heart may be hard for Westerners to understand. Kusaka had made a painstaking effort to persuade the admirals to consider his officers' point of view. Because these were unprecedented orders, they could be carried out only if they were acceptable. But beyond this, we all knew that orders in the Imperial Navy were absolute. Kusaka told me after the war that this was the hardest ordeal of his life. He explained further, Ito was prepared for certain death when he took command of the shrunken Second Fleet. Having been a deputy chief of staff for so long, he evidently felt acute responsibility for our continuous defeats. Few people retained common sense in those days. A kamikaze spirit permeated the entire Navy. Upon acceptance of the orders, all ranking officers attended a formal briefing in Yamato. It concluded with remarks by Admiral Ito, who said, "In view of the extraordinary nature of this mission, commanding officers will remove from their ships all cadets, the sick, and, any others who are considered unfit. This is a matter for your discretion." Returning to Yahagi, I called an emergency meeting of all officers and non-coms at the forecastle. I explained the orders to them, carefully studying the face of each man. The air was tense, but to my surprise and relief, no one appeared upset. In conclusion, I said, "These are extraordinary orders. But let me make this clear. If any of you believe you can be of better service by skipping this sortie, you are to leave the ship along with the cadets, the sick, and others considered unfit for the mission. I request any such of you to call at my cabin immediately after this conference." Mine was a broad interpretation of Admiral Ito's instructions, but I felt sure it was what he had intended. In my cabin, I gazed forlornly at the picture of my family, and considered that most of Yahagi's men were family men, wondering how many would come to raise conscientious objections. The idea of herding 1,000 men to certain death did not appeal to me. I was ready for the knock at my door, but was surprised when my executive officer, Commander Uchino, entered. "Captain, there are 22 cadets and 15 men who are sick." "Is that all, Uchino? Are there none of the crew who wish to leave?" "No, sir. Every man is eager to comply with the orders." I went out on deck where the 37 men were waiting and said to them, "You are ordered to leave this ship now. I know that you will all be given a better chance later to fight for the cause of our country." As I turned away, a young man leaped from the ranks and cried, "Please allow me to stay, sir. I am not of much use, but will do any job if you let me stay." Another lad wept. "Why must we be put off just because we are fresh from the academy? We can surely clean latrines." I groaned silently as the others fidgeted to burst out with further appeals. To ward this off, I cleared my throat and declared, "You joined this ship only 2 days ago. You have not even completed your introductory tour. As skippers of the future, your lives must not be wasted. My orders are to put you ashore." With that, I turned and walked away to survey the bustling activity in Yahagi. Everyone was busy checking weapons and instruments. Almost 100 men were sharpening bayonets to be used after we went aground at Okinawa. The 72,400-ton battleship Yamato came close to shore to pick up pipes from the Tokoyama fuel depot, and the tanks of this huge oil centre were soon drained. While 3 barges alongside Yahagi were supplying fresh water, I asked Uchino about the state of our general provisions. He replied, We were full loaded at Kure and have on board at least 20 days of supplies for our 1,000 crewmen. In view of homeland shortages, why don't we put ashore all but 5 days of our provisions? There is no need of taking along so much extra food on our one-way mission." "I agree," said Uchino. "Let's ask the barges to relieve us of all extras." The commander of the barges was bewildered by our request that he accept the bulk of our cargo. In fact, he objected, saying he had no authority to take our extra stores.